Good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Kraft, and on behalf of everybody at Forum Europe and our event partners, Microsoft, I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to all of you to this virtual webinar focusing on critical infrastructure and resilience regulation. So over the course of the next 2 hours, we're going to be talking about this issue in details and addressing the question of how to best build a consistent compliance framework that both spurs trust and innovation in the digital single market. So we've got almost 400 of you registered to participate in the webinar today, which is fantastic, and I think shows the huge interest that there is in this topic. I can see from the platform that it's filling up nicely, so it's great to have all of you with us. And we have a stellar lineup of speakers with us as well to discuss these key issues. And in a second, I'm going to be passing over to Forum Europe's chairman, Paul Adamson, who's going to be moderating the discussions and introducing our speakers. But before I do, I just wanted to speak very briefly about a couple of practical elements. So first of all, I would like to mention and say a few words about the virtual platform that we are using today. So I'm sure this is going to be familiar to many of you who have maybe participated at Forum Europe events, virtual events in this way before. But for those of you who have not, I wanted to draw your attention to the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. This is an important part of the platform because this is the area that you can use out there to get involved in the discussions and also to interact with your fellow participants. So first of all, you will see in the panel there, the chat area. And this is the area that we want you to use to give your questions, your comments, and we want to hear from you via that area just there. So we're going to be starting in a second with two introductory presentations, and our speakers here will be taking questions immediately following each of their presentations. And then during the panel discussion that follows these, we're also going to be leaving plenty of time to address any questions or comments from the floor. So please do use that area to put your comments in, to put your questions in. Don't be shy. We really do want to hear from you. So we do invite you to get involved. Secondly, if you click on the event tab in the right-hand side panel, this will enable you to access the people tab. And this allows you to then see who else is live on the site, who else is live and participating in the event. And also, if you wish to send private messages to individuals, to reach out to each other, and also to arrange bilateral one-to-one or group video meetings. So all of that's possible on the system as well. So please do feel free to take advantage of that. Finally, I just wanted to mention the hashtag that we're going to be using for the event. So you can see on the screen just below me now, running across the screen, we do have a hashtag that we're using, which is #CriticalInfraRegs. So if you're going to be tweeting about the event, or if you want to follow what others may be saying on Twitter, then please do use this. And also, if you wanted to copy in the handles of either ourselves or Microsoft, those are also running along the screen at the bottom there. So without further ado, I think it's time to get started. We're really looking forward to what I am sure is going to be 2 hours of really interesting discussions. So without further ado, I would like to now welcome to the stage Paul Adamson. As I said, Paul is chairman of Forum Europe. And Paul, we're delighted to have you with us to be moderating the discussions today and to introduce our speakers. So welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. And let me also extend a warm welcome to everybody out there watching and taking part in today's discussion. Let me very briefly set the scene for the discussion. Over the last few years, and more recently, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, cloud services have turned into a formidable enabler of the digitalization of European companies in many sectors, spurring economic growth and fostering local economic opportunities. And for the daily lives of many European citizens and businesses, digital infrastructure is today as critical as energy, transport, or banking, in turn enhancing the need for regulation. Comprehensive resilience regulation is, of course, essential to safeguard all these critical infrastructures in Europe. It can bring the benefits of more legal certainty, clearer accountability, and enhanced trust. It also lays the foundations for a digitalization model in line with European rules and values that not only leads through standards on privacy or cybersecurity, but also through sustainable economic growth that fosters local economic opportunities. Yet an increasing level of regulation also brings with it the risk of a gradual rise of complexity in the resilience compliance environment. there is a need to avoid the risk of putting in place overlapping requirements at both the EU and the member states level. The recent NIS2, ECI2 and DORA proposals are prime examples in that regard and illustrate the difficulty in defining security concepts, the tension between horizontal and vertical regulations, and the risk for national fragmentation impacting the digital single market. Today's webinar will explore in detail the legal and compliance aspects of new resilience requirements for cloud computing and particular critical sectors. It will explore the contribution that cloud service providers can bring to enhanced resilience across sectors. It will also dive into the interplay between vertical and horizontal regulation, discussing the importance of a harmonized resilience framework at the EU level. We will start with a keynote presentation from Jakub Borytyński, as you all know, Head of Unit Cybersecurity and Digital Privacy Policy at DG Connect at the European Commission. And if we have time, I hope to have the opportunity to ask Jakub one or two questions. But without further ado, it gives me very great pleasure to hand over to Jakub. Over to you, Jakub.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I mean, you presented definitely the background of what has been happening over the last year, which probably more than anything else, again, stressed the importance of concerted action on cybersecurity. So if you can go to the next slide, I would like to perhaps, just very briefly, to point to you what have been some of the, let's say, main objectives of the NIS2 vision. Clearly, and again, I will not go into details because my intention will be indeed to focus primarily on the topic of today's debate, that is the interaction between, let's say, horizontal and sectoral legislation. But clearly, more sectoral coverage, and I would say more harmonization. These are some of the, let's say, key lessons that we had taken from the process of the review. And the next slide would just provide a snapshot of basically what are the, let's say, key elements of the NIS2 proposal. We kind of kept the structure of the first NIS, but you have a number of, let's say, new elements, new mechanisms put in place, which I think put a lot of emphasis on the importance of cooperation, of voluntary information sharing. We have new things such as coordinated vulnerability disclosure framework at national and also supported by action at European level. Well, I will not dwell onto that because indeed, given the time restrictions, I would like to focus on what's related to specifically to those interactions with other legislation. So the next slide gives you an overview of what was this main elements of the increase of the sectoral coverage. I think we started, with a sort of traditional critical infrastructure and with a quite heavy process of identification. So those things, I mean, the identification process is gone. And as you have seen, we have come up with some important new additions, which in a way reflect, some of the evolutions that we have seen over the years. You see also the process of which has driven our choice, and we write about it in details in the impact assessment, digital intensity, consultation with the stakeholders, and also the practice, and obviously also very much experience of COVID-19. I think this also shows to you, that indeed, our intention is to indeed make NIS a strong horizontal framework for regulation of cybersecurity in the society and economy in general. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this is for us indeed an essence, and I would say we believe in this principle of retaining NIS as a horizontal framework, given the fact that cybersecurity threats propagate basically irrespective of what are the, let's say, regulatory or sectoral boundaries. And I think what we refer to as NIS ecosystem that we have been jointly building with member states over the last 4 years proved to be quite universal tool. I mean, also notably expressed by the fact that this pivotal work on 5G security happened indeed within the network of national competent authorities within the cooperation group, and we feel that this is something that would indeed benefit for basically economy and society as a whole. So our approach to sector legislation, the Commission's approach to sector legislation, is indeed, to go for it if it's strictly speaking necessary, and I think that is there has been indeed good reasons why we have come up with the proposal on DORA. What is, I think, very important element of the NIS2 proposal is the empowerment for the Commission to adopt secondary legislation, and notably to actually take into account of sectoral specificities. So I think this in the future could be an important tool to indeed, if there is an objective need to come up with more specific security measures for a particular sector, we could do it faster and more efficiently and still keep the sector within the NIS ecosystem. Now, looking into specifically to DORA, I mean, clearly, this is a first mover pioneer sector in terms of cybersecurity for a good reasons. This is where digitalization happened first, and also where actually, sorry, to the telecom sector. Of course, telecom sector is also one of the pioneers. But anyway, there was a lot at stake, so also the degree of investment in cybersecurity was actually quite critical. And we had quite a complex picture in this sector, and DORA was indeed aimed to actually streamline those provisions, and I will then in a moment say a bit more details about how these two instruments will interplay. Critical infrastructure instrument, of course, is not per se a sectoral instrument. It is complementary to the NIS, given its focus on physical security. And obviously, there is a very different starting point. I mean, critical, let's say, physical dimension of security of critical infrastructure has been traditionally seen as a very much a national matter. So from that point of view, the original instrument, which is still in place from 2008, has been quite, I would say, modest, both in terms of scope and level of ambition, which I think simply reflected the reality. That's why you would see some important differences between in the way the two documents are, I mean, two legal texts are framed. And I think if you talk about the scope, of course, there is an alignment in terms of sectoral coverage between Annex 1 essential entities of NIS and the coverage of SER. But at the same time, we have an identification. So ultimately, we are talking about a much smaller pool of companies that would be in the scope of SER instrument as compared to NIS. Let's go to the next slide. Can we move to the next slide? Oh yeah, we are. Next slide. I'm sorry for it's quite small on my screen. Let's go to the next slide, please. Excellent. So, legally speaking, DORA is sensu stricte lex specialis to NIS. Now, again, what was for us essential was to make sure that, while DORA sets out specific rules concerning security measures, reporting requirements, and the system of supervision, at the same time, what is valuable and what is relevant to the companies in other sectors, remains part of the NIS ecosystem. That's why financial entities will be reporting to DORA national competent authorities, obviously, but the information about these incidents would also be transmitted to a single point of contacts under NIS directive. Very importantly, and Paul mentioned, of course, the issue of cloud. Really, the world moved on. I remember how we had to fight and struggle to make sure that cloud is in the scope of the first NIS. I think for now, it's obviously so essential and so critical that no one would question the fact that this should be subject of a regulation at European level. And also, this is the reason why we have decided to consider cloud services as essential entities. What is important message? I think with the way we frame two instruments, there would be no double reporting for cloud providers. Obligations under DORA are the obligations on financial entities. What is indeed an additional element is the oversight on cloud service providers that could be in addition to the oversight under NIS2. So the elements of making sure that financial sector does remain the part of a wider ecosystem you see here on this slide. You know, it is notably the issue that if you come to the NIS cybersecurity strategies at the national level, what you do for the financial sector should normally be part of it. I already mentioned this critical element that the information derived from notifications is being transmitted to NIS competent authorities, and also that we have this cooperation between authorities enshrined into the law. Well, DORA has been proposed by the Commission 4 months before NIS. We are aware of certain, let's say, elements, I would say details that needs to be fully aligned, and obviously, you know, there is it is quite and documents naturally evolve in the interinstitutional process. I mean, the draft legislation. So this is something that we take very, very seriously, and I think notably, you know, in the context of the council work, there is now going to be specific attention paid to these issues, so that we actually can make sure that at the end of the day, we land with a coherent system and with all appropriate references, and you know, in practice that would work. We can have the next slide, please. I think there was, yeah. Let me just double check, because I have a strange impression that we might have missed one slide. Yes, the slide on SER proposal. But I would say correct. I will not get into too much of a detail. I think there is what we hear from the stakeholders, probably less of concern that we see about DORA. But what is actually also quite essential is that for the digital type of entities that would be identified as critical infrastructure, security measures and notification of incidents, because they would ultimately be about, you know, any incidents concerning those digital assets. So the provisions of NIS2 basically will be used. So we will avoid a situation when actually the entities would have to basically, you know, try to conform with two legal instruments. We would have a neat separation in terms of, let's say, traditional critical infrastructure, when there is a number of physical assets which indeed, you know, would be covered under SER. Well, so this has been the intention of the Commission, you know, to provide for a coherent framework. We feel that this is super important, that actually, you know, we do find, you know, through the negotiation process, we maintain this, and whatever needs to be further clarified and streamlined will be done. But for us, I think what is really essential, and this is more like from the point of view of making these instruments future-proof, is that we actually do recognize the principle of risk-based approach. That means that ultimately, overly prescriptive sector legislation, or any other type of, you know, legislation that would try to be overly prescriptive, does create a risk from the point of view of responsible management of cybersecurity, where we know all very well that, you know, the too much of prescriptive approach means kind of ticking boxes, you know, box ticking exercises, which are not good for a mature management of cybersecurity. So thanks a lot again for the opportunity to be here. I really regret that I cannot stay, because we literally have the council meeting dedicated to NIS2, which we just started, but I'm happy to still stay for one or two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Yes, you have to go back to your day job in a second, but before we let you go, two quick questions then maybe from the audience. One from Julia Mas-Kalmans from KPMG. When can we expect the DORA regulation to be published?
I presume the question is when it's going to be adopted, because
Yes.
Well, as always with the interinstitutional process, is hard to bet. I mean, the DORA, as we know, is more advanced because it started earlier. But I would say, again, I really hesitate to make predictions. But overall, I would say that if you compare the speed of negotiations and understanding of how important it is to regulate cybersecurity now with 5 years ago, we are talking about relatively short period. I mean, 1 year, 1.5 years. I would say to reach a political agreement.
And another question, which has so many acronyms, it's quite extraordinary alphabet soup, from Alexander Dodger, independent consultant. Why do DORA competent authorities have to consult with SPOC's single points of contacts and not directly with the NIS2 CAs?
Right. This was this idea came because we want to manage the burdens in a proportionate manner. Now, in some countries, you have a very decentralized model of management of cybersecurity, which, for example, means that for every sector or sometimes even subsector, you have a different authority. So, for simply practical purposes, we felt that in those countries, pointing out to spokes would make just more sense, would be more practical. This, of course, we are talking about obligations. Now, we do very much expect that DORA authorities would be part of the national NIS ecosystem. So how this cooperation would happen on the ground, is very much really left in the hands of member states. This is about the minimum requirement, but in practice, indeed, it makes sense depending on a particular situation that indeed DORA authority would reach to a specific sectoral authority in another sector. For example, in view of a specific threat propagating, let's just say, to that specific sector.
Okay, and a question.
You can, for example, imagine a situation that there could be additional cooperation between DORA authorities and, for example, authorities in charge of cloud services, which, by the way, of course, it's another, let's say, cross-border dimension, because for cloud services, we retain this kind of one-stop shop principle.
Well, that's a kind of link to our next question briefly. How does Lex Spec from Carsten Hess, how does Lex Specialis apply to the financial services sector, which has several specific regulators, and how to coordinate those different supervisors and with DORA oversight?
Yeah, but this is exactly the point. I mean, from the point of view of cybersecurity, the provisions of DORA concerning supervision and enforcement prevail over NIS. So actually, these issues are being regulated in DORA, and provisions on supervision and enforcement in the NIS2 will not apply to the financial entities in the scope of DORA.
Okay, and a final question, then we'll let you go, Jakob. From Sabine Meyer of Bundesnetzagentur, are there other legal instruments that are considered lex specialis, for example, the European Electronic Communications Code, the EECC?
Yeah, I mean, what we have decided to do about the Electronic Communications Code was basically to bring let's say, the telecoms and all the entities in the scope of the code for the purpose of managing cybersecurity in the scope of NIS. So from that point of view, indeed, the telecommunications European Electronic Communications Code is not lex specialis to NIS. Neither NIS is lex specialis to the code, because we basically will not have security measures in the code itself.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jakob. You've been very generous with your time. We have to go back to even more pressing work than this webinar.
But I think a member of my team is definitely staying here, because we are really, really interested in this discussion. So
that's very good of you. Thank you very much. See you next time. Yeah, Jakob.
Thanks a lot.
And now it gives me very great pleasure to hand over to Paul Timmers, who's now a senior policy advisor at the European Policy Centre, but of course had a long distinguished career at the European Commission, DG Connect, and many other hats he wears these days. Paul will now give us a presentation, and which I think is going to be very interesting, on critical infrastructure and resilience regulation. And over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Paul, and I will try to share my screen and hope that this works well so that you can all follow my presentation. If it doesn't work, then tell me. You should see a cover slide that says critical infrastructure and resilience regulation. If that's not the case, please do interrupt me. So what I will do...
Sorry.
Okay? Yeah. Good, I can go ahead. So what I will do is, in the very short time that I have, cover quite a lot of ground, because you have seen these legislative proposals, and for those people who like to read hundreds of pages of legislative text, this is really paradise on critical infrastructure and resilience. And I will briefly compare key elements, and especially focusing on NIS2 and DORA that already Kuba also mentioned. Some changing perspectives on the industry that might influence the way we look at these legislative frameworks and the common legislative framework. And a few words also on the wider picture of governance and geopolitics. So kind of I go from the tactical, operational to the more strategic and geopolitical. Now, setting the scene a little bit, already mentioned, there's a lot of legislation around, and actually just in a minute, something else was mentioned in the Electronic Communications Code. So we've got the Cyber Act, NIS2, the ECI 2, DORA, Digital Markets Act, artificial intelligence legislation, EIDAS revision that is coming. We've got cloud policy, and who knows what else will come there. And all of these, and I could also mention AML, PSD2, all of these have certain resilience elements, the sectoral, non-sectoral, vertical, horizontal is also mentioned. And many different actors are actually addressed, EU level, member states, global actors. But important to see is that this fits also within a larger policy framing, where the European Union is also having policy around innovation and trust, digital autonomy, there are the finance and recovery agendas. So let's not take a too narrow perspective. Now, nevertheless, the question is, with all these new laws, do they actually deliver? Are there risks of inconsistencies? Are there risks of unnecessary burden? And is this actually a framework, all these laws together, that is future-proof when we look at resilience? Well, let's start comparing some of these elements. And as said, we'll mainly focus on NIS2 and DORA. So the revision of the Network and Information Security Directive and the digital operational resilience in the financial sector. And just to remind, they have more or less common elements, the role of the member states, risk management. But for example, DORA has also a chapter on testing, digital operational resilience, and a chapter on ICT third-party providers. Now, right at the start, of course, a natural question would be, why is the one talking about cybersecurity and the other one talking about digital operational resilience? And as always in these legal texts, you then have to go looking at scope, subject, definitions, and they are kind of more or less compatible, but not quite identical. And I guess that may be still subject to some discussion. In a certain sense, digital operational resilience are all the measures that you need to take for your operational integrity in order to get also cybersecurity. And cybersecurity itself is defined in the Cyber Act as anything that you need to do to protect your networks and information systems. Now, the one is horizontal, a directive, the other is vertical, a regulation. That's true, but to a degree, also these words you shouldn't take too literal. For example, there are some sector-specific mentions in the NIS directive on domain name management as a sector, you might say. One is a lex generalis, the other a lex specialis. Again, that is true, but you may wonder, is that really always necessary? Let's take another sector. The energy and electricity sector, they have some directives that talk about cybersecurity and risk management. They have a recommendation on how to deal with standards in cybersecurity, but they don't consider that as a lex specialis. And it could have been a lex specialis like DORA. So also these type of, the necessity of having lex generalis and lex specialis, you may always also question how that evolves over time. Interestingly, is in cybersecurity, you focus on essential and important entities for the continuity of activities in economy and society. But I think something very important is brought into DORA, which is the focus on systemic risks, which is this idea that actually there are dependencies and the system may get destabilized by spillover effects, by contagion, and also by non-technical matters like losing trust, in case a bank system is hacked. People may lose trust and you may get a bank run, you may get panic. And that aspect is less dealt with actually in NIS. That's more this focus on the individual entities that are essential or important. Then of course, in NIS2, we have the digital infrastructures, cloud, electronic signatures. We have a similar kind of notion, perhaps, but somewhat different again, is the ICT third-party providers in DORA. And notably, there's a lot of focus there on cloud. Then there's an important difference, I think, which is that DORA is quite explicit on the contract that the financial entities have with their ICT third-party providers, like the cloud service providers. But NIS2 is only implicit on that relationship between these two. And I will say a few more words about that. Then in NIS2, we find supply chain security requirements. And the origins of that are clearly the whole discussion around 5G security, the 5G security recommendation, and actually quite relevant also nowadays. I mean, just think about an incident like SolarWinds. Whereas in DORA, this is actually more implicit in the system, in the overall system risk assessment. What is it that your suppliers that are providing the hardware and the software into the ones that you're contracting with, what are they doing? Are they reliable, trustworthy or not? NIS2 is mostly is a combination of ex-ante and ex-post for the important ones and ex-ante for the essential entities. DORA is very much and fairly detailed an ex-ante type of regulation. And then finally, and there are many more differences that you can mention, there's building up, NIS2 builds up actually a cybersecurity governance. As you know, I've been involved in NIS1 myself, and at that moment, the whole system was emerging of how do you do cybersecurity governance across Europe and in the member states, and there are sort of specific member states requirements. Whereas, of course, in the financial sector, there is a wealth of governance already existing, and it's clear that DORA is building on and using that legacy of the financial sector governance. They are not turning the system around and saying, let's now use that cybersecurity governance lock, stock, and barrel. Not at all. In that sense, it's clearly a sectoral vertical approach. So I'll go a bit more in detail in some of these topics. So these ICT third-party providers is an important aspect in DORA, and so they are the ones that you contract if you are a financial entity, and they could be, for example, a cloud service provider. And a cloud service provider would have hard requirements in NIS2, whereas in DORA there is an oversight by the European supervisory authorities, and there are some hard contract obligations. So an oversight of their internal operations. What is a cloud service provider or an ICT TPP doing, and hard contract obligations on the link between the financial entity and this cloud service provider or the ICT third-party provider. I'm all the time saying cloud service provider, but you have to keep in mind it's not only cloud. It can also be identity providers. It can be electronic signature providers. It can be data analytics companies. In terms of, so there's a difference in the nature of in the obligations, and then what is it about these obligations, the requirements. NIS is really mentioning state of the art. DORA is much similar, but it's not quite the same as in NIS2. For example, encryption is not mentioned, and it's not quite identical to the requirements on the internal ICT, which raises the question like, you know, what if I run that whole cloud operation actually in my internal ICT department? Do I have the same requirements as when I get it from an external provider? Briefly, ECI2, as mentioned by Kuba, it excludes financial entities and digital infrastructure providers, except that they meet each other when you are building up a national resilience strategy. General pattern, at the operational side, these vertical and horizontal ones are somewhat different, and at the more strategic level, they are starting to meet more closely. So the relationship with the ICT third-party provider is explicit in NIS2 and implicit in, explicit in DORA and implicit in NIS2. And then the supply chain risk requirements, they are mentioned in NIS2 and implicit in DORA. And then you have this issue of the national C-certs that indeed can get a notification directly from, for example, a cloud service provider at NIS2, but they might also get a notification through the financial entity, the national competent authority, and then get to the C-cert, or perhaps not get to the C-cert. The intention is that it should do that. Well, let me illustrate a little bit more this comparison, because I think it's an important kind of line of thinking, conceptual line of thinking that you find in DORA, that you think about this ICT third-party provider as a separate entity, and that there's a relationship to that one. So you have the financial entity that may have this relationship to the cloud provider or the electronic signature provider. And then you have these other entities that are actually being dealt with in NIS2. So essential or important entities like, say, a water company, a hospital, an electricity company. And of course, they may also actually use ICT third-party providers to run their business. Now, what you see is that NIS2 and DORA have a somewhat different view on that. So NIS2 actually says, Article 18, there are hard risk management requirements on these other entities, these essential and important entities. And some of these actually can be what you would call in DORA an ICT third-party provider, an electronic signature provider, a trust provider, a data center, a cloud provider, for example. So they have same requirements. In DORA, you have specific requirements on the financial entities to manage their internal ICT. And these are quite some articles and pretty detailed too. And then there is this relationship, the contractual relationship between the financial entity and the ICT third-party provider. And that one has also pretty hard requirements coming from DORA. And I would say that's pretty logical, because that's a sensitive part of your cybersecurity or your digital operational resilience, especially when you think that things can create a systemic risk. But then there is a somewhat softer, only an oversight requirement on the internal operations of the ICT third-party provider. So this is simplified. I mean, doesn't quite do justice to the complexity of the field, but it's a simplified representation of what the various relationships are. Now, let me move then from this kind of pretty detailed perspective, an operational perspective and tactical perspective in the law. Let me move to a bit higher level, namely what's happening here when we look at which industry are we talking about and what's happening in the industry. And generally, not only in the financial industry, but also in other industries, we see that the ICT business function becomes ever more important. It was essential, now it became critical, it even can lead to some systemic risks. And by the way, that does not only hold for financial, but for example, also for the electricity system. Rollover of power outs, blackouts is one of these kind of consequences that can be quite dramatic as a bank run. And it has also moved from the IT department to the CIO level to the CEO level, because actually you see that these ICT business functions become ever more richer in terms of value added. And therefore, they go from support to actually central being in the business. Actually, even some of these ICT third parties get very much close to financial services themselves. They start offering, for example, payment support. And they can be financial market intermediaries. And so you see also the concerns around the concentration of power amongst the cloud providers. And to some extent, that's addressed actually in the Digital Markets Act, which is related to this, but also in DORA itself, who says that if you have a lot of concentration, you may not have an alternative. And if your provider falls over, you can create a systemic risk. So the question is, does DORA in the long run strike the right balance? Is really the center point the financial entity or the digital part of what the financial business is about? And I think that's an important question for the somewhat longer run. And the even somewhat wider perspective to finish with, well, nearly finish with, is that governance and geopolitics comes into play. The world of finance is global, has become ever more global. Cybersecurity came from national origins, always a bit constrained by national security. But there's a trend, cybercrime hits anywhere, and digital cybercrime hits digital attacks happening everywhere. So we need to have more global collaboration and a global response. But at the same time, we see that sovereignty is under stress. In both cyber and finance, there are these concerns about the loss of control of our own autonomy and decision-making, certainly in Europe. And that leads to a call for more collaboration of like-minded parties. So you kind of see two forces pulling things apart. One pulling towards geopolitics and sovereignty, which says we only work with like-minded parties. And the other are these global challenges and opportunities that say, no, let's work together globally. And this will be visible in these compliance frameworks. One advantage at the national level, I think over the years, people have seen ever more in Europe that you cannot address all of national security only at the national level. You will have to work together at the European level. So there's pretty much more acceptance of collaboration in the field of cybersecurity. Summarizing that. Sorry for the speed of this presentation. There's a lot of cost to be told. Will they, and answering the questions, will they deliver improved resilience? I think yes, there are extremely good measures here, but the adversary is intelligent and the target is moving. So this is not enough and will continue to be watched closely. Are there risks of inconsistencies or unnecessary burden? There are some conceptual differences, as I have laid out: cybersecurity, digital operational resilience. There's the legacy in the governance. There are some details in the legal text. I guess a lot of that may be corrected in legislative negotiations, and I suggest here some improvements. I think that DORA could be much clearer that it is not only about cloud. How do you deal with electronic identity providers? And are they also an exemption or not? Personal communications, data analytics. And also checking in DORA the consistencies of the requirements that you impose on the internal ICT providers within the financial entity and the external ICT providers. Somehow it's not quite logical that they have to fulfill different requirements, and I think ENISA can definitely help here to give common standards and common approaches. Being explicit in this about its contractual link to the digital infrastructure providers would actually be quite logical too, because that is a part of cybersecurity risk. This link, if you are an electricity provider at a hospital, you'll also be using a cloud provider. And then what is happening in the contract between the two is not described in this. On the other hand, also in NISC, we could take up the more systemic cyber exercises like the threat-led penetration testing that is referred to in DORA. Conversely, DORA doesn't seem to refer to the large-scale incident management that is referred to in NIS2, the EU cyclone. And there too, you know, large-scale incidences, systemic risk, they can come from various areas, and they may have to be coordinated really at the national level and at the European level. Is it future-proof to finish then? Well, I think it's better probably to go ahead now rather than sit on these laws forever, because the threats are moving on and we need to learn how the world evolves here. And I think that this might actually be an indication that possibly in a few years' time, we need to think about a more comprehensive cyber lex generalis and some more limited sectoral legis specialis. So with that, I want to finish and I look forward to questions. Thank you. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. You managed to put so much there in the last 15 minutes or so. Extraordinary. And I like also the very diplomatic and measured way on your summary slide at the end. We have a number of questions, but I'm going to give you up to 4 minutes maximum to answer all three, okay? But you can take them one by one. They're quite complex, obviously. First question from Jonathan Cave of the Alan Turing Institute. As these measures interact, are cross-measures impact assessment and evaluation planned or in progress? For example, looking at competition, vertical impacts, innovation, etc. Asked Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you for that question. It's an extremely good question. I think, I don't know what's happening inside the House of the European Commission in terms of the impact assessment. But if this isn't happening, it's anyway a very good suggestion, because we see that some of these larger challenges that have to do with, for example, large-scale incident management, and where we also get operations in place like the Cyber Shield or the Cyclone Network, the systemic risk assessment in the financial sector, they definitely are spanning across sectors, and they need to go into an impact assessment where I would say this is not just dealing with the technical aspect, but also with these more political aspects that have been coming up, like the degree of control, autonomy that we actually have in Europe. Do they deliver this? And how dependent are we on external bodies to manage, for example, large-scale incidents in Europe? I just need to refer to SolarWinds as one of these kind of worrying signs that we may not have sufficient autonomy in this in Europe.
Thank you, Paul. Next question from Ruud Kessens, Agentschap Telecom. In what context does the Cybersecurity Act play a role from the perspective of DORA?
So it is possible that DORA builds upon standards and certification, which is indeed mentioned. that is being developed in the Cybersecurity Act. It's not a direct reference, as far as I remember, that is being made, but the schemes for certification. So, an area where this could be applicable is if we are starting about that common area of supply chain management, where we will need to have possibly certification of equipment and software that could actually come out of the Cybersecurity Act, flow into DORA, but also flow into NIS2.
Thank you. You're getting very succinct here at the end. And the final question from Christophe Bonte, I'm not quite sure, or Bonte, I'm not quite sure what his affiliation is. In your view, Paul, could DORA serve as a benchmark for other sectors, or should we have sectoral legislation, lex specialis, only if necessary, as Jacob Kuba was saying?
Yeah, as I've said, I think it's an important vertical legislation to learn from, and it has some very smart, intelligent concepts. And I just stressed that point of the relationship between the third-party provider and the financial entity. That to me makes a lot of sense to also integrate into, as a model, into future horizontal legislation. But conversely, the horizontal legislation has a number of elements that might be better spelled out in DORA or other vertical legislation like the supply chain management. So I don't think that there is here any kind of best example. It's definitely a mutual exchange that is happening, which is quite interesting because you see a confrontation or a comparison of vertical thinking and horizontal thinking. As you can expect, this gives new insights. We should learn from that.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have to move on now to the panel, but we're going to bring you in towards the end of the conference to react to the panel discussion, so we get 2 banks to our buck. Thank you very much, Paul. It now gives me great pleasure to bring into the discussion our high-level round table, and let me one by one introduce the members of this panel. First is Marnix Dekker, NIS NIS Director Coordinator at the Cybersecurity Expert at ENISA. Hi, Marnix.
Hey, good morning.
The Director General of ETNO.
Good morning.
Hi, Lisa. Andreas Papetis, a Senior Policy Expert at the European Banking Authority.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Andreas. And last but not least, Laureline Hurt, who's the EU Government Affairs Director at Microsoft.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Laureline. So I'm going to ask the panelists one by one to make some introductory remarks, so they can use that time as they see fit, either thought they had before listening to the speeches this morning, or in reaction to what they've heard from Kuba and from Paul. So first in line is Marnix. So over to you, Marnix.
Thanks, Paul. So, yeah, I had a few points. Very briefly, I would like to just introduce ENISA for those of you who don't know it. So we're a security agency, but our focus is system security and network security. So we're not a security agency in the American sense of the word. We're not looking at your data or anything else. Actually, quite the opposite. So we're trying to make computer systems more secure and networks more secure and more private and so on. We at ENISA we have different activities. So we help member states implement cybersecurity policy. We also help member states collaborate on an operational level. So we support the CSIRT network, and we have crisis management frameworks. And we also do things that are more practical, like cybersecurity challenges, cybersecurity month. We run some of the largest cybersecurity exercises in the world. And finally, we have a new unit and a new task that is around certification. Now, I appreciate everyone is up to speed with what we do and the European context. I saw there's quite a lot of in-depth questions, but I just wanted to take you briefly back to 2010. We had just had a very significant attack on Google Aurora. Suddenly people were shocked at the level of expertise of attackers. And in that time, the word cloud was kind of associated with risks, strangely enough. And when we entered this area as ENISA, we were quite fighting with this idea that security was somehow a problem with cloud or a barrier. Actually, what we thought was that cloud was actually a driver for security, something that actually improves security. When an SME goes to the cloud, typically what you see is that the machine under the desk disappears, IT gets more standard, more secure, you get 24/7 monitoring, you start to get geographic redundancy. The real experts are handling the stuff, so that we really think that, and that is still the case, that cloud is actually improving security. So that's important to put right. Now, of course, in 2012 and 13, we had the Snowden leaks, and 2015, the Commission issued a cloud strategy trying to move Europe faster into the cloud. But then you started to get the first discussions about sovereignty and who has access to data and who has who has control over that. And that was actually the first echoes of this sovereignty debate digital sovereignty debate that you see playing out again and again. And one of the important lessons of that debate is, I think, there's really no good alternative to trusting your cloud provider. And so you have to figure out where he is, which jurisdiction they are, and so on. And it's really important that customers have control over the data. And that is quite different than what you used to see with network security, right? And with network security, you can encrypt over the top layer. So you actually do not really care about where, if you trust the wire, if it routes through left or right, because you have this tunnel on top. But with cloud, because you're dealing with computations, you can't do that, right? There's all sorts of exotic schemes about cryptography in the cloud and so on and so on. But the bottom line is it doesn't really work. You need to trust your cloud provider. And now you've seen this trust issue play out now also with the 5G debate. So I'm skipping over the establishment of the NIS directive, the formation of the NIS cooperation group, this cross-EU collaboration mechanism for dealing with cybersecurity matters. And one of the first big projects they handled was actually election security. And then soon after, the 5G toolbox, which is another example of this digital sovereignty discussion. And part of the reason, of course, for this debate around 5G was because 5G is expected to make a lot of use of cloud and outsourcing. And so the question is, okay, who has access to the data and so on? Now, zipping on to the recent proposals from the Commission. So the NIS Directive 2, a very interesting proposal by the Commission. We're, of course, neutral at this stage. It's still under discussion between the member states and the Commission and the Council. But key things that stand out here is, of course, cloud becoming critical, and a strong focus on supply chain security, which is kind of saying, look, with 5G, we had these discussions about supply chain and control and access. We're going to have those similar discussions in other sectors, not only in networks. You're going to see this in the energy grid. You're going to see this in the transport grid and so on. So, it's going to be exciting times. And I quite agree with the previous speakers, Paul, particularly on the focus should be on supply chain and understanding who controls and who has access. And finally, there is a lot of focus in this panel on the precise rules and the writing down of, does it say security like this or that? I think it's important to keep in mind that critical infrastructure protection is really a partnership between government and the private sector that is running this infrastructure. It's not the public sector that invents exotic security measures that previously did not exist and then suddenly have to be implemented. It's actually the other way around. Cloud providers particularly are much more savvy about information security. It's not about telling them what to do, but it's trying to find the balance. And I think that the dialogue with the private sector should be not only about, okay, what should be the legislation like, but it should be much more like, what can the public sector offer in terms of services and support? Because we all know that security is not some stupid compliance process with a checklist. It's really a continuous process that we are engaging in together, I think. So I think that would conclude my remarks.
Thank you very much, Marnix. We'll go straight away in the interest of time to hear from Lisa.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting ETNO to present on a topic that's close to my heart, but also to the ETNO members' heart. And ETNO represent the leading European telcos operators. So, telecom networks has become the backbone of our economy and society. So that's why this topic is so important to discuss today. We've seen the current pandemic actually accelerated trends we already saw even before COVID-19 on e-commerce, on media, online media consumption. Also, increased use of digital technology. This panel is a good example of how we increase the use of digital technology, and also a shift to cloud. So we see telecommunication are both a lifeline and an enabler of modern societies. So the key mission of my members and of the telecom operators is, of course, to deliver even greater network quality and coverage as trusted and secure communication. But if you look at best-in-class connectivity, you also need our networks to be trusted and secure. So you need resilience and security to deliver this. And we see our networks are a big target for cyber attacks because we have a critical infrastructure. We store large amounts of data. So and with 5G, we'll even have more and bigger threats to our networks because we will have a deep virtualization. We will have a softwareization of our networks. And we'll have a platform supporting these things. So it's a broader ecosystem that actually increases the attack surface of the networks and vulnerability points. But we also offer many security features. So there are both benefits and, of course, threats we need to mitigate here. And with the Internet of Things, we see millions of IoT connected. The estimate is in 2025, it's 30 billion. So there is even an increased threat to networks and security here. But if I have to come back to the resilience and the topic of this network, of this seminar, I actually come from a heavily regulated sector. The telecoms are regulated. So we have the code, the European Electronic Communication Code, that regulates how telcos manage their networks and the impact of security incidents and their users. And we also have the 5G security toolbox, and we have the proposed directive on security of network information system, NIS2. And we have the draft directive on the resilience of critical entities. So we see that the framework for telecoms have become increasingly complex. So I would like to focus very briefly on two aspects. One is the need for regulatory harmonization and consistency. And the other one is that we should fill in the gaps of today's regulatory regime. If we look at the consistency among individual legal instrument and harmonized application of law first, we need legal clarity to protect our assets effectively. The code includes network and security obligations for telcos, including risk management and also incident reporting. But it doesn't bring a Copernican revolution, since similar rules have been a part of the sectorial framework for a long time. And also, it leaves the member states a lot of leeway in implementing the policies. So while we look at the member states are still busy transposing the code into national law, the NIS2 proposal brings the telecom sector into the scope. We haven't been in the scope before, and will repeal the security of the code when they are finally enacted. So consolidation and rationalization will be of the legal regime. It's good news, but because, as I said, today NIS doesn't include telcos, but we have seen that some members already now have designated telecom operators as essential services in their scope when implementing their measures, despite similar requirements already are applicable under sectorial law. So we think more clarity on the horizontal rules will assure service providers and competent authorities about their regulatory parameter. And hopefully we also see that it will avoid unwarranted double regulation. So a smooth transition from a sectorial framework to a NIS2 framework is, I think it's easier said than done. By the time NIS2 is adopted, telecom security rules will have been transposed or updated across the EU into different national systems already. So there will be different norms and procedures. And if we look at the national implementation of the 5G security toolbox, it gets even more complicated. With NIS2 proposal saying that the existing national guidelines and legislation is used to transpose the code that can continue to be used. How does this actually meet the ambition of avoiding fragmentation so that we can cope with cross-border threats? Also, it's very unclear the supervision and enforcement structure that will be in place under NIS, and who will be the competent authorities and what is the role for the telecom regulatory authorities. So we think we should have the highest possible harmonization and more EU level guidance on this to provide inconsistencies and legal uncertainties. My second and last point is about filling the gaps of the existing legal framework of digital infrastructure. And we find, and it's been discussed very much today, it's on the ICT supply chain. And supply chain here is extremely important because we are, as a telecom sector, preparing for major changes in the supply chain landscape with the 5G and the virtualized infrastructure. More functions will be closer to the user, and it will be more outsourced to suppliers. And we see already today a third of telecom security incidents in Europe are third-party failures, such as hardware malfunctions and software bugs. So we see an even deeper interdependence of providers and third parties in the 5G architecture that will increase, of course, the level of risk. So risk management in the supply chain has become a defining issue, not only for the telecom industry, but also for other critical sectors. We heard today, the banking, the healthcare, energy, etc. And NIS2 put greater emphasis on the assessment and the management of supply chain, and it's a step in the right direction, but the proposal fails to tackle the issue at its core. Those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So in the face of an ever-expanding supply chain that can make cybersecurity like find a needle in the haystack, critical infrastructures will still need to shoulder the lion's share of ensuring resilient networks and services and of proving supply compliance. A better allocation of the responsibility for risk management along the supply chain will make this endeavor more successful. So if the NIS2 introduce risk management and reporting obligations directly upon critical ICT suppliers, the overall resilience of critical sectors in Europe would greatly benefit. So quickly to wrap it all up, effective digital infrastructure protection needs a coherent legal regime across the single market. That's the first one. And we think a fair allocation of responsibility that reflects the growing role of ICT product and service suppliers in determining the resilience of digital infrastructure. I look forward to discussing more through the rest of the section. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. A lot of food for thought in your presentation there, that's for sure. Again, we move quickly on now to our next panelist, Andreas. If I can give you the floor, Andreas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here with you today, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting VBA in this timely event. I'm maybe adjust a bit what I'm actually planning to say after listening to Paul specifically. There are a number of interesting issues there raised, but I'm glad to actually that we're gonna have the chance to discuss it a bit later in the panel setup. So just a few words about the European Banking Authority. For those that you may actually not aware of, VBA is an EU agency established early 2011 as part of the European System of Financial Supervision, along with ESMA and EIOPA, collectively known as the European Supervisory Authorities, the ESAs. So the EBA covers the activities of banks, investment firms, payment institutions, and e-money institutions, and its objective is to contribute to the stability and effectiveness of the financial system. In this short intro, I wish to share with you a couple of interesting observations from the banking sector specifically, and then some related regulative initiatives and things going on. So through our ongoing monitoring, we did note that the pandemic has fast forwarded the digital transformation across the banking sector, as institutions now heavily rely on digital and remote solutions to perform their daily operations and continue delivering their services to customers. A remarkable shift towards digitalization has been noted, as 60% of the EU banks have reported budgetary changes to boost digital innovation. And these figures are from last year's risk assessment report that the EBA publishes on an annual basis. Almost 1 in 2 EU banks aim to increase their spending on IT upgrades and maintenance, possibly to accommodate the new way of working, such as upgrading system security and performance. With this, we did see the pandemic appears to have prompted some institutions to accelerate their move into the cloud, as it's perceived to enable the flexibility and scalability needed to help them meet current and upcoming challenges. Again, based on the risk assessment report that we're running on an annual basis, all EU banks are indeed exploring the use of cloud computing, while 75% are already using some cloud services. Notably, there was a 26% increase observed in the last 2 years across the banking sector when it comes to the cloud adoption, which might indicate a strategic move to the cloud as an enabling technology. Of course, the adoption of cloud could possibly define the future business model, as it can represent a business-driven value. COVID-19 may have challenged many banks to think hard about the resilience of their underlying infrastructure. And I think the ongoing regulatory initiatives, they do follow the same path. Now, when it comes to the regulatory framework, from the EBA side, we have been working from 2016 on cloud outsourcing, where we develop a set of guidelines aiming to provide supervisory clarity in cloud adoption. And we believe that with the implementation of these guidelines, we gave some clarity to the industry to leverage the benefits of the cloud services if they want to, while ensuring that the related risks are adequately identified and managed. So after that, we released another set of guidelines on ICT security risk management, which form part of operational resilience addressed to all financial institutions. Now, in 2019, as ESAS, we advised the Commission on a number of ICT aspects that we do now see in DORA. And just it's a historic sequence, let's say, to explain you how we view DORA from our side. So in this advice in 2019, we did ask basically to promote a stronger operational resilience and harmonization across the EU financial sector. There was different basically pieces of ICT related here and there in sectoral legislation. So there was a need to elevate those in a regulation, to have clear ICT requirements for all the financial institutions, streamline incident reporting frameworks across the financial sector, establish an appropriate framework to monitor the activities of critical third-party providers. And that's important because we did see this in DORA, the oversight, but the perspective that this should be seen, it's related to the activities that these critical providers are providing to the financial sector. So there's a specific context there. Then definitely we suggested to have a minimum level of cyber resilience. There needs to be a baseline across the financial sector when it comes to cyber, and definitely to ensure a sufficient cyber maturity level. And last September, we did actually see the legislative proposal from the Commission, DORA, which, as you may actually guess, it did base to a large extent to the advices we sent to the Commission. We did see the oversight framework for critical third-party providers. The aim is to have a detailed and comprehensive framework on digital operational resilience across the EU financial sector. Definitely the proposal is under negotiation. We as EBA are following closely this negotiation process in light of the upcoming role to the EBA as a lead overseer and the series of new mandates coming to our side. But it's important to actually know that things may change in the end. I heard a number of points raised and questions that we are aware they're under discussion at the moment. So we still need to wait and see how the final regulation will look like, and definitely how it will complement with NIS review. Then lastly, 2 more points. In cloud adoption, of course, you may be aware the Commission is also working on standardized contractual clauses for cloud services in the financial sector. We may see something this year. Then, of course, ENISA is working on the cybersecurity certification scheme on cloud services, another actually important initiative. And definitely at international level, which is very important when it comes to cybersecurity in general, we did see recent rules from the principles from the Basel Committee on Operational Resilience and the recent discussion paper from the FSB on issues related to outsourcing and third-party relationships. So we do believe that specifically ICT dependencies on third parties and cybersecurity aspects should be actually handled and have acted at international level. And we hope that DORA actually will give this push also at EU and international level. And I'll pause here and give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Andreas. A number of questions for you in the chat, by the way, so don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere for the next few minutes. Our final speaker on this panel is Laureline Hood. Laureline, over to you.
Hello. So we have been discussing a lot about resilience and protection of critical infrastructure, and that is a key policy target. And the pandemic have increased the focus on that, and that's perfectly normal. And also, as cloud computing services are increasingly used for digitalization of our society, of our sectors, of course, it is no surprise, I think, to no one that cloud computing is more and more included in the scope of resilience regulation. Now, as Microsoft, we are a big supporter of robust and effective resilience regulation. But I would like to pay some attention to some of the interesting trends and challenges that also Paul and even Jakob has spoken about. I would like to distinguish between 3 trends. The first one is horizontal sectoral. It has already been mentioned a couple of times. The second one is national versus harmonized EU approach. And the last one is the difference between cyber and physical aspects. So start with horizontal sectoral. We agree that there can be absolutely a need for both horizontal regulation in resilience and sectoral regulation. But there are, I think, a number of attention points. Examples of horizontal regulation have been mentioned. We have the NIS proposal. You have a baseline security requirements applying all over sectors. And examples of sectoral regulation are DORA, but also the telecom sector, more and more likely the energy sector. And interesting to see is that NIS takes a different approach in terms of how it the relation with the sectoral regulation. When you compare DORA, you have a lex specialis model, whereby DORA will prevail over NIS. That's the intention for financial entities, at least. And then, but for the telecom sector, NIS proposes to include the telecom regulation into the horizontal approach. So you see a different choice that has been made for these 2 sectors. Now, the lex specialis approach, and I will focus on DORA because that's the way to illustrate it easiest. The lex specialis approach works, I think, can work perfectly if you have a sector that is, I wouldn't say isolated, but that is delineated. if you have services that are being used cross-sector, and cloud computing is typically such a service, then the lex specialis approach is difficult. As Paul has very well described, for ICT, third-party service providers, and cloud computing is one of those. DORA and NIS2 are meant to apply to both, so to cloud computing services simultaneously. Now, that obviously, and in NIS we have a clear supervision. In DORA it will be an oversight, but obviously, I mean, an oversight with after all, which can become quite. It can also lead to certain resilience requirements, so it can be quite impactful, of course. And if you compare those two, if you think of those two together, you could end up with a situation whereby both of these authorities under DORA and NIS impose requirements, the same type of requirements to cloud computing providers. That can be a regulatory burden and all of that, but it can also lead to inconsistencies. And we think that that is really a concern. Imagine, for example, that the DORA authorities, could be the EBA, imposes on cloud computing providers a certain standard for encryption. And under NIS2, we would have a different standard for encryption. Well, that's an incompatibility that we would not be able to comply with without infringing one or the other framework. And that's a real concern in our view. And we think it's very important to address that in the text of DORA and NIS. And currently, we do not think that the solutions that are provided go far enough. We think there should really be a legal obligation for both authorities to cooperate with each other and to avoid inconsistencies, duplication. That's for us a key point, especially as it is likely that DORA will be a precedent for other sectors. So that was about horizontal versus sectoral. If we now looked at the national versus EU harmonized approach. So no surprise, digital services are very often provided in a cross-border mode. Think of IoT, cloud computing again. So cyber attacks, Paul has mentioned it, are cyber threats. They are playing internationally as well. So there is this consensus indeed that international coordination is really important to protect society against cyber threats and other threats. Yet at the same time, we see also that there is a strong push to keep national control over cybersecurity issues. And in terms of regulation, this can play out through different models. The EU legislator could choose for a centralized model whereby you have harmonized EU supervision or regulation. You could have a 27 member states model whereby the power to regulate and supervise is attributed locally, or you could have the country of origin or main establishment rule. Like for some services, it is currently foreseen under NIS. Here again, and I heard Lisa saying the same thing, as a provider of cloud computing services, we think that to the largest possible extent, harmonization at EU level is the preferred choice because precisely of the cross-border way these services function. And if you regulate nationally for services that are not organized nationally, you will have, again, the risk of inconsistencies, duplication, and overlaps. And we think it would be important to avoid that as much as possible. And we see currently that issue clearly in the telecommunications sector, which now also applies to OTT services, and a little bit also in DORA, because yes, DORA has a proposal for a lead overseer, but enforcement may still be national. And we think really that this is an important decision, not only because of course, because what is the overall resilience level it will lead to, but also because it has a huge impact on the digital single market. So that was for the national versus harmonized. Last very brief point on the cyber versus physical protection. Yes, Jakob has mentioned very clearly that the proposal for the CER directive aims to protect physical infrastructure. Absolutely a necessary effort, and it comes in parallel to NIS, and we appreciate that both proposals have been launched simultaneously, so that that the efforts are clear. Maybe there's probably some further room for clarification in the text themselves about what is physical protection and what is then cyber protection. What are the resilience measures that both of these three instruments aim to protect? Because what we will see, of course, is that with increasing digitalization, most of these sectors, whether it's water, energy, transport, will become more digital. So the drawing line between digital and physical needs to be, I think, probably a little bit further refined. Otherwise, very clear effort in terms of consistency with the CER proposal. So all in all, we are a great supporter of effective resilience regulation, but we try to argue for effective, clear, predictable rules and logical build of the regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laureline. So let's bring the panel back up now. And I have many questions for you. I mean, you may have questions for each other as well, but I think it's only fair to give, first of all, priority to the many questions coming in from the audience who have been very active. So wait for it. The question number one, I think, is probably addressed to Andreas, but anybody else could jump in if they want to. From Jack Schickler of MLEX. Should DORA be extended to payment providers, schemes, infrastructure like Visa, Amex, and MasterCard? And if so, what issues would that raise? And then a kind of follow-up question, comment neatly from Jonathan Kay from the Alan Turing Institute. He says, I thought the first part of DORA, risk management, reporting, information sharing, third-party risk, apply to payment service providers as it stands. It certainly should, says Jonathan. So, Andreas, how do you respond to Jack in particular?
Thank you very much, Paul. I will actually have the same first reaction as basically you mentioned. Under scope of DORA, payment service providers are captured at the moment. Of course, as we're aware, the exact and final scope of DORA is yet to be seen once we see the final, of course, regulation in place. There are discussions there, but I will actually, I do see the payment services providers being included there. I think it's explicit in Article 2. So that would be my first reaction to that. Now, about the issues that covering basically specific schemes and infrastructures, I guess someone needs to actually see what's the objective of DORA, right? It's to ensure digital operational resilience across the EU finance sector. So someone needs to see the interconnectedness within and around the EU finance sector and see what needs to be actually covered or not. Definitely, a discussion we had internally when we're discussing the scope. If you do actually exclude a specific number of entities, of type of entities, then you may actually have the weakest link, issue on one hand. And what will happen there if you want definitely to ensure financial resilience across the financial sector. And on the other hand, someone may need to actually take the proportionality principle into the picture and also the risk-based approach. So it needs to be a fine balance across the two. That would be my first reaction, basically, on this.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. Next question, I think, is addressed to Marnix, but again, anybody else wants to step in, they can do as well. From Ramana Raj, no organization given. What is ANISA's role in coordinating between the NS2 and DORA proposals?
That's a short answer. I mean, none whatsoever. I mean, these are both legislative proposals by the Commission, and at the moment they are under discussion between the member states and the Commission and the Council. And ENISA is supposed to be impartial and stand by the side, so to speak, on this. I mean, we wouldn't. It wouldn't be correct for us to already assume that the proposal will be adopted and then figure out how it would work together and so on. We have full confidence in the policy units that have delivered those proposals. I mean, on a personal note, I can say that I think they're pretty. There's a lot of tools there that we can work with. I don't foresee many problems, and it's a bit speculative now to jump a step. The member states wouldn't appreciate that, I think. So that is it's an interesting question, but it's a bit too soon for me.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Mark. I'll let you ask Agony. Linked to that, a question from Kaj Sikkerman, Agenschap Telecom. Is a detail, I'm not sure if anybody can answer this question, if not, I'll ask Paul. Is a detailed cross-reference between NIS2 and DORA available? Can anybody answer that question? Is a detailed cross-reference between NIS2 and DORA available? Ask Kai. If not, yes, Laura.
I can try to answer that one. So far, apart from the very good slides that Paul presented, I haven't seen such detailed cross-reference. But that, in part, is also due to the fact that in DORA. The oversight that is granted to the lead overseers on the ICT third-party providers is still not defined. So what will happen is that the lead overseer will assess the resilience of the ICT third-party providers, and on the basis of that assessment, will impose plans, may impose recommendations. These recommendations are still not yet scoped for the time being. So it's difficult to make that comparison today.
Okay, thank you.
If I can just add to this, Paul, if I may. Yes, there is not at the moment, as far as we're aware, detailed cross-reference. And one of the reasons is that we don't have final text yet. So it wouldn't actually make sense to have this cross-reference at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. And we may ask Paul towards the end, or if he wants to pop in earlier to address any of these questions as well. A question again from Jonathan at the Turing Institute. Is it sufficient to place responsibility on the entities identified in these various acts in relation to systemic risks mentioned by Paul, for example, especially emergent risks? Do we need something more, quote unquote, macro-prudential? Would like to have a stab at answering Jonathan's question.
Maybe a quick reaction from my side, if I may.
Yeah.
Definitely, there is a systemic element there, and there is a role for the macro-prudential authorities. Definitely, the entities at entity level, there is a responsibility to control and manage the relevant risk when it comes to micro level. But when we are talking about cyber and the extension of this, let's say, risk across the globe, and also, as I mentioned before, the ICT dependencies on third party, this can take, of course, can have a systemic impact. And that's why I mentioned in my quick intro that there is work going on at international level. For example, at FSB, there are a number of initiatives. I recall basically there's a discussion paper on risk on outsourcing and third party. So definitely there is a role for macro, but definitely it starts also at entity level as well. And we are promoting basically this position to have something at international level to address the systemic impact.
Thank you, Andrea. Lisa, are you going to come in?
Yes. I actually think it goes back a bit to what Paul said about being future-proof. I would like to call it future-oriented. What we see that is that threats are not national and not only European, they're worldwide. So looking into responsibilities being shared in a different way might be prudent for all of us. And I think this is a bit back to what Laureline also said on the harmonization. If we go into two small entities, we risk losing the objective of stopping and making the networks resilient.
Thank you. Okay, I apologize in advance for massacring the name of the next questioner. Sunkana Slibevic, forgive me for that, from the Institute of Economics Zagreb. If I try and pronounce it again, I'll probably make a worse job. The question is as follows. We have seen incidents of routers transferring data to Chinese servers, and Cisco routers have also been seen to have some flaws. How good is a coordination in data exchange and actions in real life in case of detected hardware flaws? It is not something that can simply be solved with an on-off switch overnight. Ask the questioner. Would like to try and answer that question.
Well, maybe I can say a bit about, one of the interesting bits of the NIS2 proposal is actually that the Commission asked member states to set up vulnerability disclosure frameworks and to coordinate more, and actually asked also ENISA to start running a national vulnerability database, similar to what we see in the US with NIST, and in Japan, JVD, and in China, CVD, I think. So yeah, vulnerabilities are tough to deal with, for sure, but we are dealing with them, and they can be tackled, and we have procedures and frameworks in place. And yeah, it's an interesting point to raise, actually. Most vendors, they see vulnerability disclosure and vulnerability databases and collaboration on vulnerability disclosure between member states and regions even, actually as a way to improve trust in their products. So here we actually see one of those collaboration things between public and private sector. Here you see the how do you say, it's the Commission that is finally following the lead, and the calls for a more coordinated approach on this from the product vendors. And yeah, I think this is one of those areas where we will see a lot of improvement. So it's again not so much about compliance, checkbox. It's much more about, okay, goodness, there's a hardware bug, there's a software bug, these things happen. How can we fix this now working together, rather than trivial statements like, oh, you should not have programmed a bug in your code. We all know that. It's more mature to think about how to solve it. So yeah, I think you can be a bit more optimistic, Sunjana, in your outlook on that.
Thank you, Marix. Elisa.
Yeah, but to me, it comes back to making sure that all the parts of an ecosystem is responsible for what they deliver. And I think this is where we see NIS2 it's taking the first step of including the supply chain, but we need to make sure the whole supply chain is included. So the hardware, the software, everything needs to be responsible for any incidents or flaws. And I think we need to make sure that the problem is solved as close to the source as possible. So if it is the SolarWinds showed us that you can have suppliers that has a flaw, a backdoor, and then you need to mend it there. You need to mend it at the source. Otherwise, it's also, as I was saying, it's finding a needle in a haystack. And the more we see the ICT systems are becoming more complex, the more we need to make sure that the whole value chain is covered.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, there's a quick question, I'll quickly find it, addressed to Andreas from Benoit Moreau of KPMG France. What is the target timeline, Andreas, for the EBA to publish the first set of technical standards mentioned in DORA?
That's a good question. It's not basically a target timeline for us because it would depend on the final text, as I said before. If we take the initial proposal, most of the regulatory text, the technical standards that we need to draft as IBA or ESAs, they need to be delivered to the Commission 1 year after DORA enters into force. So that's what we know at the moment, and we need to see what will be the final timelines and what actually will stay or leave in the final text. So I unfortunately cannot give, let's say, solid answer to this because of the proposal which is under negotiation still.
Thank you, Andreas. Okay, a question from Achim Klabunde of the EDPS. While SMEs may get more security than they could achieve on their premises, the fire, welcome back, Paul, by the way. We've asked Paul to come back a bit prematurely in case he'd like to answer some of these questions. Let me start again. While SMEs may get more security than they could achieve on their premises, the fire in Strasbourg seems to show that some cloud users lost data because they chose more affordable service offerings, which didn't include off-site backups. What are your thoughts on that? This asks Achim. Who would like to answer that?
It's good to see Achim anyway, so that just shout out to him.
Is that your contribution to the discussion? Okay, Paul, would you like to answer this question? You see it in the chat.
Yeah, I think that, partially this is, of course, kind of like you can put it in commercial terms, the extent that you can provide backup, double backup, redundancy, etc., maybe a selling point for certain cloud providers. And it's certainly something where scale counts. At the same time, I think one of the good things about DORA is that it makes rather explicit that you have to request from your ICT third-party providers what are your backup provisions. And more than that, you also will have to walk them through. And likewise, they ask that for internal management. So to a degree, I think this is part of the stuff that actually, then I'm looking at Marnix, I think this is kind of the stuff where it's explicitly also called for in DORA that ENISA does some work together with the European supervisory authorities to define adequate levels of, for example, backup and change management and other kind of IT technical stuff, you might say, that nevertheless, as Achim says, can be dramatic. Because if you lose your data through a fire, well, good luck.
Okay. Thank you. Let me, this now question from me. Let me, if I may, slightly broaden out the discussion briefly. Just a few days ago, last Thursday, Vice President Maros Šefčovič, in charge of better regulation, made a major speech to all of us about better regulation. And of course, he made the usual comments also, as usual, you might expect about improving, discussing with stakeholders and consulting for their opinion. The comments also about cost attached, being reasonable and proportionate, any proposal. These are not new points that are being made. I know the Commission, who is working there, are always very sensitive to this idea that they don't consult widely enough, they don't do sufficiently thorough impact assessment, they're slightly insensitive to the cost and proportionality of some of their legislative proposals. But he also makes a third point, Maros, which is about we need to integrate more strategic foresight into our better regulation agenda. And the pandemic has shown that we need to do that much more in terms of anticipating challenges ahead. And he then says our major initiatives should therefore be fit for the future, for example, by systematically studying the effect of emerging megatrends, such as hyperconnectivity and demographic change. I just thought whether just briefly to get away from some of the technicality of what we're discussing for the past hour or so, for you to respond to that. Is that something, it's a bit broader than the mere future-proofing discussion. Do any of you have any views about what Maros was saying last week? None of you. Paul.
Yeah, perhaps I can say a few words about that because first of all, I think it is absolutely necessary that you do that. The difficulty is not necessarily to do strategic foresight because there are lots of people that will come up with scenarios and ideas about where things are moving. The difficulty will be that you let the developments, the business and technological developments run in parallel with legislative and policy developments. And so this kind of thing, it's a bit ambitious, but you would rather want to think about co-design of technology and law rather than separate design. So this reactiveness that we see in law is problematic in a fast-moving area like digital. So there are certainly two things that you can do. First of all, bring those people closer together, the policy developers and the ones that are into kind of like how will the business, how will the technology develop, etc. Bring them closer together and bring them into a regular dialogue. The other, and that's more ambitious, is you may wonder whether you cannot actually build into the law mechanisms to foresee change. Not, I mean, a review clause, but actually an experiment, not an experimental, a part that looks actively at innovation that is happening and continues assessing the law and parts of the law that then may have to be modified. Now, that's much more ambitious. That's a different way of lawmaking. But it's a bit strange, isn't it, that we build a law with all kinds of rules, and then we have another legislative decision that establishes an innovation program, and they're just separate. So somehow we have a connection opportunity.
Well, as you know, Paul, many people say that regulation is supposed to regulation is supposed to be a spur to innovation. I see that Lisa and Laureline want to come in. Lisa first, then you, Laureline.
Thank you. I think it's absolutely crucial that we think strategically about regulation and development and how we can spur innovation. But again, coming from a heavily regulated industry, what we are asking for is clarity on regulation. So you have the other side that's extremely tricky. If you want to open up for a more strategic, more open regulation, that actually has the other side that you risk creating so many uncertainties, plus you give room for extensive translations of the regulation. So it is a balance of being strategic, being giving industry clarity, because the investments you need as an industry, especially in a heavy infrastructure industry as telcos, is really long-sighted. So we need to know what the regulation is for a certain time period.
Thank you, Lisa. Laureline?
Building on that, because you almost stole what I wanted to say, but is that I think in terms of regulatory consistency and building the right model for the future, we very much believe in a model whereby you start with a horizontal layer, comprehensive horizontal baseline layer, and when necessary, you build on what is needed for certain sectors, and you can maybe have to go quicker there than at certain. But when you already have a horizontal structure in place, it's probably easier to shift quickly. In sectoral or sectoral or events or circumstances.
Thank you, Laureline. Back to you briefly, Lisa. In your opening remarks, introductory remarks, towards the end you talked about regulating the ICT supply chain. What do you mean by that? Could you be a bit more specific, please?
Yes, we do think that the ICT supply chain actually have as I was saying, we have a sophisticated ecosystem of hardware, software components. We have data system, real-time, remote services, etc. And there is an asymmetry between the suppliers and the telcos. And that is actually increasing the risk and vulnerabilities along the supply chain. So I am a strong believer in that you need to solve the vulnerability issues at the source. So you need to bring it address it where the knowledge is on the hardware. And we're looking into horizontal regulation here on which is fine. We also see that there is then this too is bringing in critical entities and addressing this. But it's actually a bit unclear if we look at also the IoT regulation, if it's going to address only business to consumers or business to business environments. So from our side, of course, as telcos, we are responsible for our networks, but we're also buying a lot of the network's components from suppliers. So that needs to go hand in hand, that we all need to be responsible for our parts there. So I think NIS2 needs to be a bit more strict on including the vendors.
Thank you, Lisa. Paul?
Perhaps a complementary comment to that would be, of course, in supply chain management, you're kind of keeping your fingers crossed that you can do a lot with certification, standards, inspection, and what have you. But bad stuff will continue to happen. And vulnerabilities will pop up, and you need to also deal with that. And I think there are also serious challenges in vulnerability disclosure and the handling of vulnerabilities. For example, what you see nowadays is that in a number of instances where vulnerabilities have been signaled, that there is a time lag between signaling the vulnerability and fixing it. And in that time lag, cyber criminals, for example, massively ramp up their activities. We have seen that, for example, with the Microsoft Exchange hack, SolarWinds, and others fairly recently, but in the past also. Now, what you would want to have is that there is a clear vulnerability disclosure action, you might say. And actually, I think that's one of the things I did not mention that is mentioned in NIS2. So there's a separate article on coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And again, that's something that you may wish to consider in DORA and perhaps also even in other kind of settings as a more process-oriented part rather than a hardware and software-oriented part of managing the supply chain.
Thank you, Paul. And we all know, of course, that security is still largely a prerogative of member states, and it's one of the points that Laureline, you made in your presentation. This let's call it tension, frankly, sometimes between national and EU level action. Given that that prerogative is not going to go away anytime soon, but still the EU has this vocation to regulate, should we say? What kind of coordinated mechanisms could be identified and created to better coordinate between EU and member state action in this broad area? Laureline.
So first of all, before answering my question, I would like to mention one point, which is that I believe the interests of national member states are important and need to be taken into account clearly. But what I would like to say is it's not always impossible to do that under a more centralized model as well. Imagine that, take for example the issue of notification of incidents, right? As a cross-border cloud provider or OTT provider, we would very much like the rules for notification of incident to be the same throughout Europe, because otherwise it gets extremely hard or sometimes impossible to comply with local requirements in terms of when we have to notify an incident. We would not mind, it's a bit of a burden, but we would not mind notifying 27 times as long as the rules are clear and consistent. So I think it's not because you sometimes harmonize the rules that you cannot ensure a national interest as well. And apart from that, whenever the regulation is nationalized, then I think, yes, coordination in terms of investigations, but also processes, requirements is key.
Thank you, Laureline. Okay, another question from the audience, from Kai Sigman, Agenskap Telecom. What is the panel's view on the impact of regulation on competition between large and small companies? Pretty broad question from Kai. Presumably in this area.
Well, if I may, very briefly, I think the Netherlands is a good example. I mean, competition drives improvement, and eventually innovation drives economic growth, and that gives you security and stability and more jobs and so on. A lot of the threats that we're facing now from countries like China and so on, they will be, we can handle them better if we have a vibrant economy where small players can can quickly grow and boom. And unfortunately, indeed, in Europe, there's a lot of focus on adding rules, compliance. Also in this panel, we're speaking about rules and yeah, those kind of this compliance burden is tough for big companies, and they complain about it a lot. It's like, oh, we have to deal with 3 regulators, or we have 2 laws. They might overlap. Goodness. Now, how do I solve this? But imagine this for a small company. That is really tricky. So yeah, really important. I think in general in Europe, we need to look more at that, and not. You see that a lot with GDPR, for example, where an entire community thinks that adding rules and sanctions and you know is going to kill the big companies. That's their goal. That's their feeling. But in actuality, it affects smaller companies and startups disproportionately, and yeah, eventually that hurts your innovation. And indeed, we don't have a lot of innovation in ICT in Europe, and that's, I think, one of the core issues and the biggest risks for Europe as a continent. So yeah, I'm quite on board with the line of this question. And but yeah, I do cybersecurity, so I can only say that what we do at ENISA is risk-based. Try to keep it simple. Try not to come up with big, complicated frameworks. And I can give examples in telecom sector, for example. We have a security framework that has different levels, so it is easier for smaller providers to comply, and not only possible for big ones.
Okay, right. I'm going to bring this panel discussion to a close now. Regretfully, the time is getting on. I want to make sure that Paul has enough time to give his concluding remarks, and maybe use the opportunity, Paul, to respond to what you've heard on the panel and the other questions from the audience. And as a way to tee up your concluding remarks, Paul, this is from me, actually. Toward the end of your presentation, you talked about governance and geopolitics. And that's maybe, again, to finish off on a broader, more political note, you talked on governance and geopolitics. The Brussels effect, to what extent is a lot of what's underpinning regulation, especially including in these areas we've been talking about for the past 2 hours or so, governed by this idea that EU should try and have the vocation, certainly the ambition, to set rules, not just for member states, EU27, but for the rest of the world. And to what extent can it be seen as sometimes a victim of its own success, and then other players suddenly wake up and realize that maybe the EU should not have this exclusive right to set rules in effect for the rest of the world? But that's just a question from me. But then it was a great pleasure. I give you the floor again, Paul. Over to you now to finish off.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel for what I found great insights and very, very good questions also on the chat. And actually, Paul, thank you for that question, because that's a very good stepping stone for perhaps some comments that I wanted to add, because let me kind of take the positive view on the Brussels effect, in particular if we look at the financial sector, because the financial sector definitely has a lot of experience with cybersecurity, with digital transformation, and they are also highly challenged. You know, it's not a smooth ride that they have at all. They are in a serious transformative process, so they are also forced to rethink what they are doing. And moreover, it's the kind of sector that is pervasive across the economy, and so systemic effects, they have already seen them in the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and they know about some of the risks and the nature of the risks. So if we are managing to get clarity in the way digital operational resilience and cybersecurity is dealt with in the financial sector, if we manage to do that in Europe, that will be a big asset. What I think is quite valid is, however, what some of you have been mentioning, we shouldn't make it overly complicated. It should be having a logical build-up. There should be not an undue burden, especially on small companies. And all of that is not guaranteed. There should be room for innovation, but yet you want to do it in a controlled way, because you cannot start experimenting around. So I would also see that this is an opportunity to pose those critical questions. Is DORA and NIS2 and these others, are they also delivering on those aspects of enough competitiveness, position for SMEs, room for innovation? And these are questions that also need to be part, and they will be part, I'm sure, of the legislative negotiations. What I think the discussion then also shows is that, it's hard to get it right. There is not something that is right. You need to think about where are things not fitting quite well together, and can we get a bit better logical build-up, as Laureline mentioned it, or as some others have also said, are the relationships always completely clear? And I think there are some additional insights can be gained about what are the parties involved and the relationships between these parties. There was a bit of discussion on that, for example, about the payment processes. What are the obligations, and do you impose these obligations in a relatively open-ended way, which would be more the risk management approach, or do you need to go detailed? Finally, also to make a split between the functions that need to be fulfilled for digital operational resilience and cybersecurity, and who executes these functions. So somehow a bit puzzling will be that in the dynamics of business, these functions might be moving to all kind of other places. There will be new actors coming up, including perhaps smaller ones that take over certain functions that have to do with data processing, with transaction processing, with assurance, with safeguards, with trust, with identification, etc. These kind of new functions, and they may be landing in different companies, or they might be landing within your company. And the logic of protection, cybersecurity, resilience, systemic risk, that logic should be the same. And so I think it would also not be bad. Someone said, is there a systematic comparison, a cross-reference between NIS2 and DORA? Would not be bad if there's something perhaps a little bit detailed by detailed, and say, so what are now the generic things that I mentioned here that hold for everybody always? And what are the very specific, sector-specific things that I mentioned? The same would hold also for other pieces of sectoral legislation. I'm thinking, for example, of electricity as one of those examples, but we may have other examples too. So it's perhaps not everybody likes it that this is a detailed debate, but you will have to have this detailed debate, because that does count what is put into the details. It does count whether these are internally organized functions or externally organized functions. There's one point on which I perhaps then want to finish, and that brings it back to your Brussels effect. I am not so convinced anymore that the national push is here the dominant force. I think actually, because of this debate about sovereignty, the Brussels effect, we are moving increasingly to an understanding that, yes, national interests are very important, but you may, in certain instances, best be able to realize them at the European level and through European intervention, and get to strong European positions in certain sectors like finance, which we have successfully done in the past. And that's another kind of aspect of the Brussels effect, that I think we are not talking about a divergence that happens necessarily at the national level. I think it's about making clear that national interests can also very well be served in a number of cases, not always, but in a number of cases, by working together. Resilience is an extremely good example to do that. So I would say that someone said a strategic vision. This is part, I think, of the strategic vision that needs to be spelled out and needs to be continued to be explained and presented to policymakers, to industry also, and to national authorities. So with that, Paul, let me hand back to you. I hope that gives a bit of umbrella view.
Paul, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Paul. It gives me opportunity to put that umbrella view, and it gives me opportunity now to thank all the panel for a great discussion we've had this morning. It's tremendous, and I very much appreciate your time and your interventions, and also all the many questions from the audience. So thank you very much. Have a good day. And my final task is to hand back to Dan, who will explain some more housekeeping details. Thank you all again.
Paul, thank you very much, and I think I'd like to also echo your thanks to all of our panelists there, and of course to Paul for his introductory presentation and making his conclusions at the end, and of course to Jakob, who was with us earlier as well. So really appreciate all of your contributions. I think we've had an excellent and a fascinating 2 hours, and a final thank you. how can I forget? A final thank you to Paul Adamson as well for moderating the session excellently too. So thank you all so much. Really do appreciate that. And yeah, a fascinating discussion. So I really appreciate everyone's contribution to that. A big thank you as well to all of you out there. Paul has mentioned it too, but we really do appreciate all of the comments and questions. We had an excellent number of comments and questions coming in from all of you out there in the audience, and I think we managed to get round to most of those. So really do appreciate all of that, and to the contribution that you have made to the discussions by bringing in those key points and questions and raising those as part of the discussions as well. And a final big thank you to Microsoft, our event partner for the webinar today. Laureline, of course, has been with us for the panel, so thank you again to you, Laureline. But to her and her team, they've all been a big part of putting the event together and really making this possible, making the discussions possible here. So thank you to everyone at Microsoft for that and for an excellent collaboration. Finally, I just wanted to end by letting you all know that copies of the slides that were presented by Jakob and by Paul, and also a recording of the full event, are all available now to download, to allow you to kind of maybe recap or to catch on anything that you may have missed. An email is going to be sent out to all of you later today with details of how to access those, and you'll also be able to find them on the main event website. So that's just about it. Thank you again to all of you out there for your participation. As I said, we really do appreciate it. I think we had upwards of 250 of you participating during the event today, which is fantastic. So really do appreciate that, and for your contributions there. All that's left for me to do is to wish you all a very pleasant rest of the day, and we're looking forward to hopefully welcoming you to another Forum Europe event very soon. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.